instead of directly taking on the science, because they knew that they couldn't win that game, right? If you have to publish peer-reviewed science and really show based on the facts that, no, that's not true, they knew they couldn't do that, but they knew that they could muddy the waters. So they tried to just create the illusion of a scientific debate. You set up fake think tanks, you empower shoddy researchers by giving them funding and grants, making them look prestigious, and above all else, you pay an army of corporate flacks and lobbyists to, beat the bushes in halls of power and go on TV and radio and whatnot, and put forth the talking points about, well, we can't really be sure that cigarettes cause cancer, and it's an open question, and there's lots of debate, and so we
should the more doubt the better
right now. That's right. And there's a famous line where one of the chief architects of this strategy said, doubt is our product. And that's been basically the same playbook put in place in the climate change scenario. And so substitute tobacco companies for big oil and gas and coal companies who obviously see that the action that we need on climate change, which invariably means producing less and using less fossil fuel energy, is going to hurt their businesses. I mean, eventually it will make their businesses non-viable. And that's a very big threat if you're an oil or gas or coal business. So when you look behind a lot of the researchers and think tanks and sort of public proponents of these lines that, well, the science isn't settled on climate change, or we don't know whether humans are causing it, or even if it happens, it'll be good for humanity. It's a complicated web of money that largely stems from well-heeled oil and gas interests. And no doubt there are true believers, swept up in that tide, who just are being used by these people who put them forth. But the fact of the matter is, in terms of the actual science, the peer-reviewed science from reputable climate scientists, there have been a couple different analyses that look at all the papers published since 1990, and the consensus is anywhere from 97 to 99%. That's unheard of in scientific literature on almost any subject, to have that amount of consensus that, yes, global warming is happening, yes, humans are causing it, and unfortunately, yes, it will be bad for us if we don't start acting on it soon. That's what the science says, and don't let anybody tell you otherwise. So it's imperative that we counter this. And so what we did at EcoJustice was 2 years ago, we started an application to the Competition Bureau of Canada, and it's not sort of a natural thing that you might think of when you're thinking of climate science denial. You think, bring it to a scientific institution. But what the Competition Bureau does is, in terms of statements made for any business purpose, they enforce a prohibition. So you're not allowed to go out and, say things that are exaggerations or, misleading and false statements for the promotion of a business purpose. And there are a number of climate science denial groups across the country. They do things like, obviously, they're active on the web. They do public seminars. They even put up big billboards in cities across the country saying, climate change isn't real, it's not happening. And we say that the Competition Bureau should investigate that as a violation of that prohibition. They're making false and misleading statements to the Canadian public for a business purpose. They're trying to distort various markets in the favor of fossil fuel interests, everything from investment markets, because we desperately need our investment capital to be flowing into renewable energy, non-polluting energy, away from an overinvestment in oil and gas and coal especially, which is yesterday's news. And that doesn't just make good environmental sense, quite frankly, it's good economic sense too, because you want to be investing in the industries of tomorrow, not the industries of yesterday. So we made that application to the Competition Bureau, and they looked at it for a number of months, and then they decided to open up an investigation, and that investigation's ongoing. And we don't know yet what's going to result from that. In the United States, a number of state attorneys generals are investigating big oil companies there, especially ExxonMobil, to see whether it misled its own investors over the course of years about the risks of climate change to their business. So not just to the public, but their own investors, the people, the pension funds, the little guys who are buying shares in these big oil companies thinking that it's going to be a nice dividend-paying stock for years to come, have been arguably, it appears, misled, where if you look at what the oil company was saying internally, commissioning research saying, yeah, climate change is real, it's happening, it's going to be a big problem with big consequences, and action will affect our business. And ExxonMobil has dragged its heels over the last several decades, has had to be led kicking and screaming to any acknowledgement that the science is real, and then more recently that the reality of climate change is going to impact their business. And they're still not there in terms of how deeply it will impact it.
Charles Hatt is an environmental lawyer with Canada's only national environmental law charity, EcoJustice. The organization represents communities and sometimes nature itself to provide legal protection for the environment. Hatt witnesses firsthand the consequences of climate change and the dangers of climate change denial. Still, the massive changes society needs to make in order to help the environment do not happen in a vacuum. Concerns are often raised about the people and families who make a living off jobs in the fossil fuel industry. Hatt goes on to point out that when society switches to renewable energy, there won't be fewer jobs, just different ones, and transition programs need to be created.
There was an interesting presentation or seminar where a UBC professor has broken down the metrics and all the analysis of Site C to show that it's financially a disaster, and yet somewhere between the acknowledgement that we have Site C, that it may be a financial disaster based on this professor's work, there's still 2,600 jobs up there and families that are counting on those people for work and for income. Where's the transition point? Because that seems to be the sweet spot where we don't go to action. We deny, or we don't want to make a change because it will disrupt the status quo and I may be out of work.
Right. So the key phrase there that you used is status quo. And it doesn't mean that there will be less jobs in the economy of tomorrow, which is going to have to be an economy powered by renewable energy, non-carbon polluting energy. It doesn't necessarily mean that there'll be fewer jobs or that there will be worse jobs. There'll be different jobs. And that economy is already here in large part. There's more jobs being created by renewable energy than by the fossil fuel industries. Those industries are, unfortunately, for the companies, but not necessarily for the workers, because we need policies that provide for a just transition for them into different industries, whether it be renewable energy industries or others where they can find good jobs. But unfortunately for the oil and gas companies, they have a shelf life, right? That industry is going to have to go away in my lifetime.
We are conditioned to deny and forgo change because change is hard and taking responsibility for our actions is harder. It is easier to stick with the status quo than it is to accept reality and act. But as Al Gore stated back in 2017, we have a choice to make: the hard right or the easy wrong.
I had a teacher when I was a child who said we all face the same choice in life over and over again, between the hard right and the easy wrong. And as often as not, the easy wrong turns out to be not easy at all. When you take the time frames of climate into account, it would be the hardest, most destructive choice humanity ever made. What seems like the hard right choice now is the only clear path toward a sustainable future.
The information can be overwhelming and discouraging, but there are many reasons to be hopeful. Change is not only possible, but it's already happening in many places around the world. There's something exciting about living in a transitional period. In a place where we have the technology and finances to change to renewable resources, we've seen more policies in the last 2 years than in the last 20. Zipporah Berman continues.
I've been really trying to figure out, is it true? Is it true that we have the technology and the finances to make the changes that we need to make? And there's no question that we can still have advances. But what I found out is that it is true. We can make the changes that we need to make, and I'm much more hopeful than I was when I first started working on this, because now we're seeing them happen. We've seen more new policies for climate change, for renewable energy, for constraining the production of oil and gas and coal around the world in the last 2 years than we have in the last 20. I think sometimes that these issues hit a tipping point, and there's this kind of magic moment where the technology is there and the finance is there. And, Bloomberg New Energy Finance reported last year that we're now seeing more investment into renewable energy globally than we are into coal, oil, and gas combined. And so we've hit a tipping point on the finance now. And so now it's large scale. There was a time, I think, 20 years ago when solar panels and wind farms were like the pipe dreams of a bunch of West Coast hippies. And that's not true anymore. Now it's at scale. We're seeing massive concentrated solar plants. We're seeing, China's putting up a new wind turbine every hour right now. And, some of these new concentrated solar plants can fuel 250,000 homes, 250,000 homes. These are big projects. They can happen at scale now. So I think I'm pretty excited. And I think we have the capacity, like we're living that moment in industrial society where we're going to re-envision how we travel and how we live. And it's happening in front of our very eyes.
We were talking about renewable energy, and I know that Germany has done some pretty marvelous things, and the 80% of its power is coming from green sources most of the time, or at least 50% of the time. How are we doing in Canada?
Well, we have a lot of advantages in Canada already because, for example, in British Columbia, the majority of our power is coming from hydro. I'm sure if we had to build those dams now, they'd be pretty controversial. But we have a legacy of this clean energy. Had massive environmental impacts at the time, but now we have that legacy. So we're not in a situation, certainly in a lot of places in the country, where we're still struggling with such a dirty energy source. And the good news is that we have some new policies federally as of last fall. I really think of the last decade in Canada as the lost decade on climate policy because the Harper government just adamantly refused to put forward any new policies or laws that dealt with climate change or renewable energy. In fact, they rolled back a number of them.
The fact of the matter is, a handful of large corporations are to blame for the vast majority of the world's carbon emissions and environmental waste. Changing the power structures that use fossil fuels for capital gain in our society is necessary to combat the climate crisis. While reducing waste and making greener choices will reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, Berman emphasizes that the most significant impact we can have is by advocating for change and voting according to our values.
And that's because this isn't just about changing technologies. It's about whether or not power and money and strength is held in the hands of a few or the hands of many. Because renewable energy by its nature is distributed. A lot of it is community owned. And you know what? No one owns the sun and the wind. So once the infrastructure is in, it's free. And there's a whole connection to power in every sense of the word and to justice, economic justice. And I think that is an important thing that we need to think about. And I think in Canada, we're increasingly seeing that these issues are entirely connected to First Nations rights and to treaty rights. And I think trying to figure out how to include and respect nations as nations in our decision making, as well as trying to ensure that we're doing a greater distribution of power and wealth as we address these issues, that's the hard stuff. And if we really start to figure that out, then we're making systemic change.
Individual choices and actions, however, are not without benefit. Chad Frischman is the Vice President and Research Director of Project Drawdown, a research project to determine what actions society can make to best prevent the advancement of the climate crisis. Even something as simple as reducing food waste and eating more plant-based meals can have a significant positive impact on the environment. The climate crisis can be an overwhelming and disconcerting issue, but it is important not to feel hopeless and despondent. We have the power to switch to renewable energy, and we're already seeing increased conversation on the climate crisis. Zipporah Berman goes on to reflect on a conversation with her grandmother about how the world is constantly changing, and how if we make the right choices, we can change the world for the better. She continues to emphasize that we shouldn't be feeling guilty or guilting others about our environmental impact. We should be engaging with our lawmakers to make better decisions. Ultimately,